What is the Big Bang Theory?
It is a theory of the origin of the universe. According to the Big Bang Theory, the universe began as the result of an explosion that occurred between 15 and 20 billion years ago. Over time, the matter created in the Big Bang broke apart, forming galaxies, stars, and a group of planets we know as the Solar System. The theory was first put forth by Edwin Hubble, 1889 to 1953. Who observed that the universe is expanding uniformly and objects that are greater distances are receding at greater velocities. In the 1960s, Bell Telephone Laboratories scientists discovered weak radio waves that are believed to be all that remains of the radiation from the original fireball. The discovery further supported Hubble's theory, which puts the age of the universe between 15 and 20 billion years. Astronomers have observed that the galaxies are still moving away from each other and that they'll probably continue to do so forever, or at least for about the next 70 billion years. If the galaxies did come together again, scientists believe that all of the matter in the universe would explode again. In other words, there would be another Big Bang, and the result would be consistent with that of the first. It would produce a universe much like the one people live in today. Another supporter of the Big Bang Theory is British theoretical scientist Stephen Hawking, 1942. In 1988, Hawking, who is known for his theories on black holes, gravitational forces in space, made by what were once stars, published his ideas in the best-selling book A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes.
When did people first migrate to the Western Hemisphere?
From Europe's discovery of the American Indian at the end of the 15th century to the present. The questions of who the Native American populations are and how they came to the Western Hemisphere, North and South America and the surrounding waters, have intrigued scholars, clergymen, and laymen. The advancement of anthropology has yielded some answers. Since no skeletal remains of a human physical type earlier than Homo sapiens have yet been found in the Americas, researchers have concluded that the continents were settled through migration. Many scholars believe that Asians came to America during two periods, the first, between 50,000 and 40,000 BC, and the second, between 26,000 and 8,000 BC. They are believed to have come by way of a great land or ice bridge, Beringia, over the Bering Strait, between Asia, Russia, and North America, Alaska. This causeway was covered by water from about 40,000 to 26,000 BC because of a period of melting, which would have prevented passage. Most scholars also agree that there were several discrete, and perhaps isolated, movements of various peoples from Asia to the Americas. The migrations might have been prompted by population increases in the tribes of Central Asia, which impelled some to move eastward in quest of food sources, animals, As game moved across the Bering Strait, hunters followed. Over time, population growth caused early man to continue southward through the Americas. So that by 8000 BC there were primitive hunters even in Tierra del Fuego, which forms the southernmost part of South America. Around 5000 BC the disappearance of large game animals in both North and South America produced a series of regional developments, culminating in the emergence of several great civilizations, including the Inca, Maya, and Aztec.
What is the controversy over Tibet?
During the 7th and 8th centuries A.D., Tibet emerged as a powerful Buddhist kingdom. But beginning in the 13th century, it came under the rule of the Mongols. And in the 18th century the Manchu dynasty took control of the area. Beginning in 1912 Tibet again knew a brief independence. But in 1950 the country was invaded by Communist China. After years of turmoil, which included an anti-Chinese rebellion in 1959, Tibet was made an autonomous region within Communist China in 1965. But the autonomy is nominal. And Buddhist culture in Tibet has been all but destroyed. Buddhists fled Tibet, some of them taking refuge in India, which is where the current Dalai Lama, the 14th, leads a nonviolent struggle to free Tibet from China. In 1989 the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
Why was the election of Vicente Fox a landmark?
The July 2000 election of businessman-turned-politician Vicente Fox, 1942, was monumental in Mexico's political history because it ousted the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, that had ruled the nation for 71 years. It was a victory not only for Fox but for his National Action Party, PAN. The former Coca-Cola Company executive had turned to politics in the 1980s. Following a highly successful career in business, in 1987 Fox was elected to the National Chamber of Deputies. And in 1995 he was voted in as governor of his home state of Guanajuato. He promised voters economic and political reform, with a particular emphasis on ridding the nation's government of seemingly endemic corruption. Fox was sworn into office on December 1, 2000, for a 6-year term. In 2003 midterm elections, Fox's PAN party lost ground to the PRI.
Disorder continued in what was the defenestration of Prague?
The event occurred at the beginning of what came to be known as the 30 Years' War. 1618-48, when Bohemian Protestants, angered at the destruction of their church, appealed to Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, 1557 to 1619, to intervene on their behalf. When the appeal proved unsuccessful, in May 1618, rioting broke out in the Bohemian city of Prague, and two of the emperor's officials were thrown out of windows. In other words, they were defenestrated. Bohemia, even as a new emperor ascended to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. King Ferdinand II, 1578 to 1637, a Habsburg, wielded an enormous amount of power. And in 1620 he squelched the Bohemian Rebellion, which cost the Bohemians their independence. Further, Catholicism was reinstated as the state religion. These events caused other Protestant lands within the Holy Roman Empire to take notice. Soon the kings of Denmark, Sweden, and France entered into their own campaigns fighting King Ferdinand II for control of German lands. But the conflicts weren't strictly about religious freedom. Reducing the authority of the powerful Habsburg family became a primary objective as well.
Who were the Whigs?
They were members of political parties in Scotland, England, and the United States. The name is derived from Whiggamer, meaning cattle driver, which was a derogatory term used in the 17th century to refer to Scottish Presbyterians who opposed King Charles I of England, 1600 to 1649. Charles, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, was deposed in a civil war and subsequently tried in court, convicted of treason, and beheaded. The British Whigs, who were mostly merchants and landed gentry, supported a strong parliament. They were opposed by the aristocratic Tories who upheld the power of the king. For a short period during the 18th century, the Whigs dominated political life in England. After 1832 they became part of the Liberal Party. At about the same time, the Whig Party in the United States emerged as one of the two major American political parties. The other was the Democratic Party that Americans still know today, which supported President Andrew Jackson. 1767 to 1845, for re-election in 1832. Though Jackson's first term of office had proved to be somewhat controversial, the Whigs were unable to elect their candidate, Henry Clay. 1777 to 1852, of the so-called Southern Cotton Whigs, and Jackson, called Old Hickory, went on to a second term. In the election of 1840 the Whigs, whose leadership had succeeded in uniting the party, were finally successful in putting their candidate in the White House. But William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, died after only 32 days in office, and his successor, John Tyler, 1790 to 1862, alienated the Whig leaders in Congress, and they ousted him from the party. In 1848 the Whigs put Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, 1784 to 1850, in the White House, but 2 years later he, too, died in office. His successor, Millard Fillmore, 1800 to 1874. remained loyal to the Whigs, but there were problems within the party. The last Whig presidential candidate was General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. 1786 to 1866, in 1852, but he was defeated by Franklin Pierce, 1804 to 1869. Shortly thereafter the Whig Party broke up over the slavery issue. Most of the Northern Whigs joined the Republican Party, while most of the Southern Cotton Whigs joined the Democratic Party.
What was Camp David II?
In July 2000 President Bill Clinton, 1946, invited Israeli and Palestinian Authority leaders to the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, to hammer out a final peace agreement in the Middle East. In what could have been the major breakthrough in the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, 1942, agreed to a Palestinian state, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the administration of all Jerusalem holy sites by a third party, i.e. neither Israel nor Palestine. In exchange, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004, was asked to sign an end of conflict addendum to the final agreement, which would have required him to bring the militant Arab group Hamas under control and end all Palestinian attacks on Israelis. But Arafat refused the deal. The July 11 to 25 meeting ended without an agreement. Violence erupted again in Israel, beginning the Second Intifada.
What is philosophy?
From the Greek philo, meaning love of, and Sophia, meaning wisdom, philosophy is literally a love of wisdom. In practice, it is the pursuit of understanding the human condition, how, why, and what it means to exist or to be. Philosophers use methods such as observation and questioning to discern the truth. Philosophy is traditionally divided between Eastern thought and Western thought. Further, Western thought consists of 5 branches: metaphysics, concerned with the nature of the universe or of reality; logic, the laws of reasoning; epistemology, the nature of knowledge and the process by which knowledge is gained; ethics, the moral values or rules that influence human conduct; and aesthetics, the nature of beauty or the criteria for art.
Who was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was a young French woman named Jeanne Barrot. In 1766 Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, 1729 to 1811, a French naval officer, undertook an around-the-world expedition, which was successful and returned to France in 1769. But the crew made an interesting discovery en route. When the French arrived in Tahiti, the Tahitians immediately noticed something the crew had not: that one of the servants on the expedition was a woman. Jean Barrett had been hired in France by one of the ship's officers. Khmer Khan, who also served as botanist for the expedition. Khmer Khan did not know Barrett was a woman. Her secret discovered by the Tahitians, she confessed, revealing that she was an orphan who had first disguised herself as a boy to get employment as a valet. When she learned about Bougainville's expedition, she decided to continue the disguise in order to carry out an adventure that would have been impossible for a woman in that day. She was the first woman known to have circled the globe.
What are the elements of Japanese kabuki?
The most popular traditional form of Japanese drama, kabuki, features dance, song, mime, colorful costumes, heavy makeup, and lively, exaggerated movements to tell stories about historical events. The drama had its beginnings in 1575 when Okuni, a woman, founded a kabuki company. In 1603 at Kyoto, women danced at the Kitani shrine, playing men's roles as well as women's. In October 1629 kabuki became an all-male affair by order of the shogun Iemitsu, who decided that it was immoral for women to dance in public. Just as in Elizabethan England, women's roles were then performed by men. The performing art became increasingly popular during the 1600s, eclipsing bunraku, puppet theater, in which a narrator recites a story, which is acted by large, lifelike puppets. Today kabuki remains a viable art form, borrowing from other forms of drama to adapt to changing times.
What was the Boxer Rebellion?
It was a Chinese uprising in 1900, which was put down through the combined forces of 8 foreign countries including Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. The Chinese-Japanese War, 1894–95, had seriously weakened China. And in 1898 the country agreed to lease its Kyoko region to Germany. Soon other European countries followed suit, and before long Western influence was being felt in China. This angered many Chinese, including members of a secret society that opposed the Manchu government for having allowed the foreign incursions. This secret society was made up of athletic young men. And so they were called Boxers by China's Westerners. Between June 21 and August 14, 1900, Boxers rebelled against anything foreign and began a raid of the country that was intended to drive out all foreign influence. The uprising was aimed at not only Westerners and foreign diplomats, but missionaries, Chinese Christians, and any Chinese who were thought to support Western ideas. Houses, schools, and churches were burned. Much of the destruction took place in Beijing. And when foreign diplomats there called for help, it arrived from 8 countries. The Manchu government did not welcome this interference in its affairs and promptly declared war on the eight nations. On September 7, 1901, the Manchu government signed a peace settlement with the foreign countries. The Boxer Protocol called for China to punish officials who had been involved in the rebellion and pay damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The United States, Britain, and Japan later returned part of the money to China, specifying that it be used for educational purposes.
Who wrote the U.S. Constitution?
In spirit, the U.S. Constitution was created by all of the 55 delegates to the meeting that convened on May 25, 1787. In Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, called the Constitutional Convention an assembly of demigods. And with good cause, the delegates were the young nation's brightest and best. When the states had been called upon to send representatives to the meeting, 12 states answered by sending their most experienced, most talented, and smartest men, Rhode Island, which feared the interference of a strengthened national government in state affairs, sent no one to Philadelphia. Even in such stellar company, the document did have to be written. While many had a hand in this process, it was New York lawyer and future American politician and diplomat Gouverneur Morris, 1752–1816, who actually took on the task of penning the Constitution, putting into prose the resolutions reached by the convention. Morris had the considerable help of the records that James Madison, 1751–1836, of Virginia had kept as he managed the debates among the delegates and suggested compromises. In that capacity and in that he designed the system of checks and balances among the legislative, Congress, the executive, the President of the United States, and the judicial, Supreme Court, Madison had considerable influence on the document's language, quite rightfully earning him the designation Father of the Constitution. The original document, drafted by Morris, is preserved in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. While the Constitution has been amended by Congress, the tenets set forth therein have remained with Americans for more than 2 centuries, and they have provided proof to the countries of the world that a constitution outlining the principles and purposes of its government is necessary to good government.
What were vassals?
In the Middle Ages, 500–1350, a vassal was anyone who was under the protection of another and therefore owed and avowed not only allegiance but a payment of some sort to their protector. Peasants, serfs and village commoners were always vassals to a lord, whether it was the lord of the manor or the lord of the fief. But the lord of the manor was himself a vassal to the lord of the fief. as kingdoms were created, with many fiefs within their jurisdiction. The feudal lords became the vassals of the kings.
What was the War of Reform?
It was the period in Mexican history from 1858 to 1861 when the Federalist government collapsed and civil war ensued. In 1858 President Ignacio Comonfort, 1812 to 1863, who had become Mexico's leader when he helped overthrow President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794 to 1876, in 1855, felt political pressure and fled the country. Benito Juárez, 1806 to 1872, who had served as Minister of Justice and Minister of the Interior, assumed the presidency. His position was immediately opposed by Centralists who rallied around rebellious army forces. Under this pressure, the Federalists, led by Juárez, withdrew from Mexico City and set up the capital at Veracruz, on the Gulf Coast. There they had control over customs receipts, which allowed them to purchase arms and finance their government. Eventually they defeated the Centralists and re-entered Mexico City in January 1861. Juárez was elected president later that year, but his authority was challenged again with the arrival of the French, who quickly put Maximilian, 1832 to 1867, in power as Emperor of Mexico. Juárez led the country in a successful campaign against the French, who were expelled in 1867 when Juárez resumed the presidency. He died in office in 1872.
What happened to the Celts during the Roman Empire?
The Celts were an Indo-European people who by 500 B.C. had spread across what is now France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the British Isles. And by 200 BC they had expanded as far as present-day Bulgaria and Greece. When the Romans conquered much of Europe, about 300 BC, many Celts were absorbed into the Roman Empire. However, those Celts living in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, southwest England, and Brittany, in northwestern France, were able to maintain their cultures. And it is in these regions that people of Celtic origin still live today.
What was the anti-apartheid movement?
It was an international movement to throw out the decades-old system of racial segregation in South Africa. The word apartheid means separateness in the South African language of Afrikaans. Under apartheid, which was formalized in 1948 by the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, minority whites were given supremacy over non-whites. The system further separated non-white groups from each other so that mulattoes, those of mixed race, Asians, mostly Indians, and native Africans were segregated. The policy was so rigid that it even separated native Bantu groups from each other. Blacks were not allowed to vote, even though they were and are the majority population. Apartheid was destructive to the society as a whole and drew protest at home and abroad. But the South African government adhered to the system, claiming it was the only way to keep peace among the country's various ethnic groups. In 1961 the government even went so far as to withdraw from the British Commonwealth in a dispute over the issue. Protesters against apartheid staged demonstrations and strikes, which sometimes became violent. South Africa grew increasingly isolated as countries opposing the system refused to trade with the apartheid government. The no-trade policy had been urged by South African civil rights leader and former Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, 1931, who led a nonviolent campaign to end apartheid and in 1984 won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. During the 1980s the economic boycott put pressure on the white minority South African government to repeal apartheid laws. It finally did so, and in 1991 the system of segregation was officially abolished. White South African leader F.W. de Klerk, 1936, who was elected in 1989, had been instrumental in ending the apartheid system. In April 1994 South Africa held the first elections in which blacks were eligible to vote. Not surprisingly, black South Africans won control of parliament, which in turn elected black leader Nelson Mandela, 1918, as president. De Klerk was retained as deputy president. The two men won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their efforts to end apartheid and give all of South Africa's peoples full participation in government. In 1996 the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a panel headed by Desmond Tutu and charged with investigating the political crimes committed under apartheid, began work. Its investigations continued in 1999, with many findings proving controversial.
Who was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, 1540 or 1543 to 1596. Who set out in 1577 to explore the Strait of Magellan. He did so, investigating the coast of South America. He and his crew plundered coastal Chile and Peru in the process. Before continuing into the South Pacific and heading northward, he eventually reached the coast of present-day California, which he named New Albion. A name that did not stick, and claimed it for Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. He continued sailing northward and is believed to have reached Vancouver still in search of the Northwest Passage. Not finding it, he was much too far south, explorers would later learn. He sailed westward. He reached the so-called Spice Islands, today known as the Moluccas, in East Indonesia in 1579. Drake also found the Indonesian island of Java. before continuing west through the Indian Ocean. Rounding the southern tip of South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope and skirting the western coast of Africa northward to Sierra Leone. From there Drake returned home to Plymouth, England, where he landed in 1580, the first Englishman to travel around the world. He was knighted by the Queen 1 year later. It is also Drake who, along with his fellow countryman Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, bears the dubious honor of introducing tobacco to his homeland. In 1586 Drake returned from another expedition to North and South America, where he did battle with Spanish fleets for control of lands. He then picked up colonists in Virginia, who carried with them potatoes and the materials and implements for tobacco smoking. Drake remained in the service of the Queen for his whole life, going on to fight and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. On a mission to the West Indies in 1596, Drake died on board his own ship.
Who were the most important rulers of the Roman Empire?
The 500 years of the Roman Empire, 27b. C to AD 476, gave history some of its most noteworthy and most diabolical leaders. The major emperors are names that are familiar to most every student of Western civilization: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Diocletian, and Constantine I, called the Great. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero were the first 5 emperors. A succession covering 75 years of Roman rule. Octavian, 63b.ca.d14, later known as Augustus, became Roman emperor when, after the assassination of his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, a power struggle ensued and he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra to take the throne. Under Augustus's rule, from 27 BC to AD 14 began the 200 years of the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace. During this time no power emerged that was strong enough to sustain conflict with the Roman army. Consequently, Rome was able to turn its attention to the arts, literature, education, and trade. As second emperor of Rome, Tiberius, 42b.ca.d37, came under the influence of Roman politician and conspirator Sejanus. DAD 31. Tiberius was the adopted son of Emperor Augustus, and though he had been carefully schooled and groomed to take on the leadership role, ultimately he became a tyrannical ruler. The final years of his reign were marked by viciousness and cruelty. Upon Tiberius's death, his nephew Caligula, AD 12 to 41, ascended the throne. Born Gaius Caesar, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, since he was brought up in military camps and at an early age had been dressed as a soldier. For a short time Caligula ruled with moderation, but not long after he came to power, he fell ill and thereafter exhibited the erratic behavior for which he is well known. Most scholars agree that Caligula must have been crazy. He was murdered in AD 41, and Claudius, also nephew to Tiberius, was then proclaimed emperor. Claudius 10b.ca.d 54, renewed the expansion of Rome, waging battle with Germany, Syria, and Mauritania, present-day Algeria and Morocco, and conquering half of Britain. Though his administration was reportedly well run, he had his enemies, among them was his niece Agrippina the Younger, AD 1559, who is believed to have murdered him in 54, after securing her son. Nero, as successor to the throne. In Nero, AD 37-68, the early Roman Empire had perhaps its most despotic ruler. Though his early years in power were marked by the efficient conduct of public affairs. In 59 he had his mother assassinated. She reportedly had tried to rule through her son. And Nero's legacy from that point forward is one of ruthless behavior. He was involved in murder plots, ordered the deaths of many Romans, instituted the persecution of Christians, and led an extravagant lifestyle that emptied the public coffers. He was declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and in the year 68 took his own life. With the exception of Augustus, the 1st century AD of the Roman Empire was marked by extreme rulers. The 2nd century AD was marked by the leadership of soldiers and statesmen. Trajan, 53-117, who ruled from the year 98 until his death 19 years later, is best known for his military campaigns, which expanded Rome's territory. He was also a builder constructing bridges, roads, and many buildings. When Marcus Aurelius, 121-80, ascended to emperor in 161, he had already been in public office for more than 20 years. A man of great experience, he was reportedly both learned and of gentle character. His generals put down revolting tribes, and, in addition to winning victories along the Danube River, his troops also fought barbarians in the north.
What was Nazism?
Short for National Socialism, Nazi was a derisive abbreviation that held. The Nazi doctrine rests on three philosophies: extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. As one of the Central Powers, Germany's defeat in World War I, 1914-18, resulted in severe punishment of that country and its seriously diminished role in Europe. The doctrines of Nazism took hold there, appealing to the masses with promises of a rebuilt Germany. The Bible of Nazism was Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, 1923, which asserted the superiority of a pure Aryan race. Aryans are non-Jewish Caucasians, particularly those of Northern European descent. Led by an infallible ruler, called the Führer, the re-establishment of a German Empire, the Third Reich, and the systematic annihilation of people who Nazis perceived to be Germany's worst enemies, Jews and Communists. Nazis ruled Germany from 1933. when Hitler rose to power as head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In their own country, they enforced their policies through a secret police. The Gestapo, storm troops, called the SS, and Hitler's bodyguard, called the SA. Elsewhere in Europe, the Nazis used sheer force in imposing their system. Their aggression and ruthlessness resulted in World War II, 1939–45. During the Holocaust, 1933–45, Nazi soldiers, led by Hitler's henchmen, persecuted and exterminated upwards of 12 million people, at least half of whom were European Jews. Nazism ended in 1945, when Hitler killed himself and Germany lost the war. The doctrine, which demonstrated how detrimentally powerful a theory can be, was outlawed thereafter. Sadly, the late 20th century saw a resurgence of neo-Nazism among extremists in Germany and the United States.
When was money introduced?
The use of money dates back some 4,000 years, when people began using something of recognized value, such as precious metals including gold and silver, to purchase goods and services. In the absence of money, all transactions were made on the barter system, which is an exchange of goods and services negotiated by the parties involved. The introduction of money simplified the acquisition of products and services. The ancient country of Lydia, in the western part of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, is credited with the first use of standardized coins, made of gold and silver, in the 7th century BC.
How does the Catholic Church determine who will be Pope?
Present-day procedures for electing a pope, who serves the Church until his death, vary from those of earlier times. Before the 300s, the clergy of Rome and the outlying areas cast votes in what was essentially a local papal election. Throughout history, some of Europe's powerful rulers tried to influence the outcome of papal elections in order to establish a pope who would be favorable to their leadership. This interference in the process sometimes resulted in disputes over who was the rightful pope, with more than one pope claiming authority based on the support of emperors or factions within the Church. Those claiming to be popes but who were considered illegitimate are called anti-popes. The process observed by the Roman Catholic Church today was established over time. The first important decision came in 1059 when Pope Nicholas II, c. 980–1061, declared that papal electors must be cardinals. In 1179 the Third Lateran Council established that all cardinals have an equal vote and that popes may only be elected by a two-thirds majority. This came after Pope Alexander III, c. 1105–1181, had been opposed by three anti-popes: Pope Gregory X, 1210–1276, after being elected to the papacy following a 3-year vacancy. Assembled the Council of Lyon in 1274, which decreed that the cardinals must meet within 10 days of a pope's death to determine the papacy. Further, the council required that the cardinals remain together in strict seclusion until they have elected a new pope. Today, when a pope dies, the dean of the Sacred College notifies all cardinals of the vacancy. The cardinals convene at Vatican City in a meeting that is required to begin within 20 days of the pope's death. Any of 3 electoral processes may be used: ballot, which is most common, unanimous voice vote, or the unanimous decision of a committee of 9 to 15 delegates. 4 votes are taken a day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, until there is a 2/3 majority vote. As soon as a decision is reached, the dean asks the pope-elect if he accepts the position. Once he accepts, he is considered pope and has full authority over the church. He then proceeds to select a name, which he announces to the cardinals. Following these private meetings, the results of which are eagerly awaited by devout Roman Catholics, white smoke is sent up a chimney of the Vatican Palace, signaling to the crowd in St. Peter's Square that the election is complete. The smoke is created by burning ballots from elections in which a 2/3 majority was not achieved are also burned, but in a way that creates black smoke. In this way, the public is apprised of the cardinal's decision-making process. The oldest cardinal has the honor of making the official announcement to the people in St. Peter's Square. Then the people are blessed by the new pope in his first official act. The coronation of the pope is held later.
What was the Night of Terror?
It is a little-known episode in the American suffragist movement that took place on November 14, 1917, at the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. After President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, took office in January 1917, activists began picketing daily outside the White House, demanding the right to vote for women. It was the first time in history that demonstrators had marched at the White House. The suffragists carried banners that read, "Mr.
Citizens were encouraged to build bomb shelters. School children participated in air raid drills. Civil defense films, such as How Can I Stay Alive in an Atom Bomb Blast?
were screened, and entire towns conducted tests of how residents would respond in the event of an A-bomb. Meantime, the leak of top-secret information from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, was traced to New York City machine shop owner Julius Rosenberg, his wife, and her brother, David Greenglass. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin writes that the short, plump Mrs. Rosenberg looked more like one of my friend's mothers than an international spy. Indeed, the case marked the first time American civilians were charged with espionage. And the trial made international headlines. Though the Rosenbergs were only two of many involved in the conspiracy. Theirs was the heaviest of the punishments handed down in the cases against the spy ring. For their betrayal and their refusal to talk, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death. In issuing the sentence, Judge Irving Kaufman accused the couple of having altered the course of history. The penalty rocked the world, as Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter put it. They were tried for conspiracy and sentenced for treason. They were electrocuted the evening of June 19, 1953, as New York's Union Square filled with an estimated 10,000 protesters.
Who were the robber barons?
They were the industrial and financial tycoons of the late 19th century. The early builders of American business. Some called them the captains of industry. The robber barons included bankers J. Pierpont Morgan, 1837 to 1913, and J. Cook, 1821-1905, oil industrialist John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, steel mogul Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919, financiers James J. Hill, 1838 to 1916, James Fisk, 1834 to 1872, Edward Harriman, 1848 to 1909, and Jay Gould, 1836 to 1892, and rail magnates Cornelius Vanderbilt, 1794 to 1877, and Collis Huntington, 1821 to 1900. These influential businessmen were hailed for expanding and modernizing the capitalist system and lauded for their philanthropic contributions to the arts and education. But they were also viewed as opportunistic, exploitative, and unethical. Many factors converged to make the robber baron possible. The new nation was rich in natural resources, including iron, coal, and oil. Technological advances steadily improved manufacturing machinery and processes. The population growth, fed by an influx of immigrants, provided a steady workforce, often willing to work for a low wage. The government turned over the building and operation of the nation's railways to private interests. And, adhering to the philosophy of laissez-faire, non-interference in the private sector, the government also provided a favorable environment in which to conduct business. Shrewd businessmen turned these factors to their advantage, amassing great empires. Reinvesting profits into their businesses, fortunes grew. The robber barons, especially the railroad men and the financiers who gained control of rail companies through stock buyouts, hired lobbyists who worked on their behalf to gain the corporation's subsidies, land grants, and even tax relief at both the federal and state levels. The robber barons converted their business prowess into political might. In Washington, politicians grew tired of the advantage seeking. Representatives of the nation's business leaders. Reform-minded progressives complained that the robber barons lived in opulent luxury, while their workers barely eked out a living, their families teetering on despair. After dominating the American economy for decades, changes around the turn of the century worked to curb the influence of the robber barons. In 1890 the federal government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, making trusts, combinations of firms or corporations formed to limit competition and monopolize a market, illegal. Workers continued to organize in labor unions, with which corporations were increasingly compelled to negotiate. The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was established in 1887 to prevent abusive practices. And in 1913 the 16th Amendment was ratified, allowing the federal government to collect a graduated income tax. Though many American businessmen and women would make great fortunes in the 20th century, by the end of the 1920s the era of the robber barons had drawn to a close.
What was the first book?
It was the Diamond Sutra, published in the year A.D. 868. Archaeologists discovered it in the caves of the Thousand Buddhas, at Kansu, Gansu, China.
What is the history of the Dow Jones Industrial Average?
A measure of stock prices of important industrial companies, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. DJIA, was first printed in the Wall Street Journal in 1897. The average is an indicator of the market overall and is used, along with other indexes, by investors, stockbrokers, and analysts to make investment forecasts and decisions. The Dow, as it has come to be called, was conceived of as a summary measure of the stock market, an index that could be used to analyze past trends, indicate current trends, and even predict future ones. The first DJIA averaged the prices of 12 major companies. The list had been expanded since, in 1916 it averaged the stock prices of 20 companies. In 1928, 30. Adjustments have been made as the result of company mergers and dissolutions. Though it is a measure only of the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow Jones average has been called a barometer of the stock market. News of fluctuations in the DJIA can affect market prices around the world.
When was email invented?
Short for electronic mail, email was invented in 1971 by computer engineer Ray Tomlinson, 1941. Who developed a communications program for computer users at the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The result was ARPANET, a program that allowed text messages to be sent to any other computer on the local network. ARPANET is now hailed as the Model T of the information superhighway. The technology expanded in the 1970s with the use of modems, which connect computers via telephone lines. Within a decade of its introduction, email had become widely used as a communications mode in the workplace. In the 1990s, usage expanded rapidly to Internet users at home, schools, and elsewhere. Some technology analysts call email the killer app of the Internet, the most powerful tool on the worldwide computer network.
What was radio's immediate cultural impact?
During the 1930s, radio, pioneered in the late 1800s, was woven into the fabric of everyday American life. People across the country in cities, suburbs, and on farms tuned in for news and entertainment, including broadcasts of baseball games and other sporting events, as well as comedy and variety shows, dramas, and live music programs. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, used the new medium to speak directly to the American public during the trying times of the Great Depression, broadcasting his fireside chats from the White House. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, gathering around the radio in the evenings was as common to Americans as watching television is today. Networks offered advertisers national audiences, and corporate America eagerly seized the opportunity to speak directly to people in their own homes. The advent of television in the 1950s and its growing popularity over the next 2 decades changed the role of radio in American life. Having lost their audience to TV, radio programmers seized rock music as a way to reach a wide, albeit a very young, audience. Many argue that the rise of the musical genre kept radio alive. In the decades since, radio programming has become increasingly music-oriented. Talk and news programming are also popular.
Why is the Kennedy presidency called Camelot?
The term was actually assigned by Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Shortly after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22, 1963. The former First Lady was talking with a journalist when she described her husband's presidency as an American Camelot, and she asked that his memory be preserved. Camelot refers, of course, to the time of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and has come to refer to a place or time of idyllic happiness. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's widow, who had with fortitude and grace guided her family and the country through the sorrow and anguish of the president's funeral, quite naturally held sway over the American public. So when she suggested that the shining moments of her husband's presidency were reminiscent of the legends of Camelot, journalists picked up on it. Despite subsequent revelations that there were difficulties in the Kennedy marriage, Public opinion polls indicate that the image of Camelot, albeit somewhat tarnished, has prevailed.
What is a poet laureate?
A poet laureate is someone who is recognized by his or her country or state as its most eminent and representative poet. Officially, a poet laureate is appointed or named by the government. England's first, if unofficially titled, poet laureate was Ben Jonson, 1572–1637, a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare acted a leading role in the first of Jonson's great plays. Every Man in His Humour, 1598. In 1605 Jonson began writing a series of masques, short allegorical dramas that were performed by actors wearing masks, for the court. Years later, in 1616, he was appointed poet laureate and in that capacity received a substantial pension. Among Jonson's works are Volpone, 1605, works, a collection of poetry published in 1616, and which includes the oft-quoted line, "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and pleasure reconciled to virtue," 1618. Some sources trace the first British poet laureate back to Edmund Spenser. 1552 or 1553 to 1599, who is called the poet's poet. However, the title of poet laureate was not officially conferred on an English writer until 1638, when poet and dramatist William Davenant, 1606 to 1668, who was reputed to be the godson or even the illegitimate son of Shakespeare, was given the honor. Other poet laureates of England include John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, and Lord Alfred Tennyson, 1809 to 1892.
When did the United Nations begin its work?
The United Nations, UN, began fulfilling its mission very soon after it was chartered. The first meeting was held January 10, 1946, when the inaugural session of the General Assembly opened in London. On February 14, the UN voted to make its headquarters in the United States. Its complex was built in Manhattan, overlooking New York's East River, in 1950.
What was the temperance movement?
Temperance was an American movement that began in the mid-1800s to outlaw the manufacture and consumption of alcoholic beverages, which were viewed by many to be a corrupt influence on American family life. By 1855, growing public support to ban liquor resulted in 31 states making it illegal to some degree. But a national policy of temperance was still sought by many. During the 1870s, temperance became one of the cornerstones of the growing women's movement. As the nation's women, joined by other activists, mobilized to gain suffrage, the right to vote. They also espoused sweeping cultural changes. In 1874 a group of women established the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. In 1895 the Anti-Saloon League was formed. Such societies, which grew out of a fundamentalist spirit, found an increasing voice and eventually influenced legislators, many of whom were dry candidates that the societies had supported, to take federal action. Even President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, supported prohibition as one of the domestic policies of his New Freedom program. The movement met with success in January 16, 1919, when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1788, was ratified, forbidding people to make, sell, or transport intoxicating liquors in the United States and in all territories within its jurisdiction. Though Congress, which proposed the amendment on December 18, 1917, provided states with a period of 7 years in which to ratify the amendment, it took just over a year for it to be approved. Such was the prevailing spirit among lawmakers. After the amendment was made, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce it. But government nevertheless found prohibition difficult to enforce. Bootleggers, who made their own moonshine illegal spirits, often distilled at night. Rum runners, who imported liquor, principally from neighboring Canada and Mexico. And speakeasies, underground establishments that sold liquor to their clientele, proliferated. Soon organized crime ran the distribution of liquor in the country, whose citizens had not lost their taste for alcoholic beverages. The government now found itself with a bigger problem. As the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and police worked to control and end mob violence, and as the country suffered through the early years of the Great Depression, lawmakers in Washington reconsidered the amendment. On February 20, 1933, the U.S. Congress proposed that the 18th Amendment be repealed. Approved by the states in December of that year, the 21st Amendment declared the 18th Amendment null, and the manufacture, transportation, and consumption of alcoholic beverages was again legal in the United States, ending the 13-year period of prohibition. Herbert Hoover, 1874 to 1964, president at the time of repeal, called prohibition a noble experiment.
What is Keynesian economics?
Keynesian economics are the collected theories of British economist and monetary expert John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946, who in 1935 published his landmark work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. A macroeconomist, he studied a nation's economy as a whole. Keynes departed from many of the concepts of a free market economy in order to ensure growth and stability. He argued that government needs to be involved in certain aspects of the nation's economic life. He believed in state intervention in fiscal policies. And during recessionary times he favored deficit spending, the loosening of monetary policies, and government public works programs, such as those of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, to promote employment. Keynes's theories are considered the most influential economic formulation of the 20th century. Having played a central role in British war financing during World War II, 1939–45. Keynes participated in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, where he helped win support for the creation of the World Bank, which was established in 1945 as a specialized agency of the United Nations. The body aims to further economic development by guaranteeing loans to nations, extending easy credit terms to developing nations, and providing risk capital to promote private enterprise in less developed nations. It's interesting to note that Keynes was a key representative at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles was drawn up, officially ending World War I, 1914–18. He quit the proceedings in Paris, returned to private life in London, and in 1919 published The Economic Consequences of Peace, in which he argued against the excessive war reparations that the treaty required of Germany. Keynes foresaw that the extreme punishment of Germany at the end of World War I would pave the way for future conflict in Europe.